So hi everyone. Today I have the pleasure to introduce you Dr. Lorien Nesbitt. Lorien is a postdoctoral research and teaching fellow at the University of British Columbia with appointments in the Faculty of Forestry and the School of Population and Public Health. Her research focuses on urban forestry and social ecological interactions in urban environments with an emphasis on human health, well-being, climate change, and equity. She employs mixed methods approach as appropriate to the research project and has expertise ranging from spatial analysis and machine learning to qualitative interview analysis and survey design. She is currently examining three aspects. First, the relationship between greenness exposure and public health outcomes in urban environments, with a focus on spatial temporal metrics and new remote sensing data sources. The second aspect is urban forest governance and resilience to social and ecological stress. The third aspect is urban green equity in multicultural cities. Let's welcome Dr. Nesbitt.
Hi, thanks for that kind introduction. I'm still getting used to being called Dr. Lorien Nesbitt. It's very exciting. Okay, so today I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of some of the research that I've been involved in recently, my current research, and then some of my planned future research. Hopefully you find it interesting. And it's all kind of pulled together or centered around this idea of urban forestry for multicultural cities. I'm going to talk a bit about my background first briefly, then my primary sort of areas of research recently that I've completed, and then ongoing and future work. So my background, since 2001. So I did my Bachelor's of Science in Ecology and Philosophy at the University of Toronto, and then followed that up with a Master's of Forest Conservation, also at University of Toronto, focusing on biodiversity conservation, protected areas planning, and urban forestry. I thought at first during my BSc that I was going to be a philosophy prof, but then changed my focus and decided, okay, ecology maybe. But interestingly, now I really am interested in the philosophical aspects of what I do, so perhaps this is an ongoing interest of mine. Then sort of being 23, 24, I guess, I decided to go to Ecuador and work with the Canadian International Development Agency as an environmental sustainability officer, working with local communities on sustainable tourism and how they could live sustainably off the land without degrading the forests around their communities. I also had the opportunity to be a sessional lecturer at one of the universities there in ecology and biology, which was my first real teaching experience. Then one Sunday in Ecuador, I got kind of bored and decided to apply for a job in Canada and ended up going up to Yellowknife. I didn't think I was going to get that job. I just thought, well, it's Sunday, I have nothing better to do, and I like the North because I actually grew up in Yellowknife. And ended up getting offered this job in climate change adaptation, working with First Nations communities in Northern Canada. And really loved that work. And so then after finishing that contract, I decided to work on my own as an independent consultant. I had started my consulting company back in 2007, but really sort of got going in that work in 2010. Kind of went back and forth between Ecuador and Canada, working on climate change adaptation, community forestry planning, sustainable agriculture, cumulative impacts assessments with local communities and First Nations groups. And it was a really interesting time. I also at that time decided to get into documentary film because I was doing a lot of work with local people, and I wanted a way to really give voice to their experiences and concerns rather than always having to translate it through my own worldview. And so developed my skills in film production as a tool to represent the views of local people in their own words and in their own way. So then when I was living in Ecuador and going back and forth between Ecuador and Canada, I was living in a really dense city, and I discovered how important urban trees and green spaces are to me, just because I was living without them kind of at that time. And this is how I sort of came back to urban forestry and decided to come to Vancouver to do a PhD in urban forestry, and started looking at issues of equity in particular that I'll be talking about today. And during my time at UBC, I've also had the opportunity to be a sessional lecturer. I did a lot of work as a planning associate with EcoPlan International, a local consulting company, and am now a postdoctoral research and teaching fellow here at the School of Population and Public Health and in the Faculty of Forestry. So there's my last, I can't do math, how many years is that? 17 years. Okay. Research. This is the biggest part of this presentation. Hopefully it's interesting. I know it's dark in this room, but if you have questions, please just put up your hand and I'm happy to answer them or clarify anything. And hopefully there'll be time for questions afterwards if I have my timing right on this, which is totally not for sure right now. Okay, so the first piece of research that I really got involved in here at UBC was valuing ecosystem services and trying to understand how much are ecosystem services worth. Just to give you some background on what ecosystem services are, you may already be aware of the term, but we're talking about all of the services and benefits that humans experience in or from natural environments or natural things. And in this case, I'm really interested in how they operate in the urban environment because we have all these pressures that we experience in urban environments, like poor air quality or flooding because of hardscape or paved areas. And so ecosystem services are sort of how urban vegetation helps us manage these things. And they range from things like improving our emotional health and lowering our stress to giving us opportunities for recreation and improved physical health to increased property values and community development. And so we are really seeing cities become more interested in how these ecosystem services operate and what their values are. And this is because as cities and other levels of government are prioritizing investments in urban green infrastructure, which is what they often call sort of urban forests and urban green things, they want to know what is their value, how can we make the business case for investing in these things, and where should we be investing? Where should we be prioritizing our investment? So we got hired by the Canadian Forest Service to do a national synthesis of the social and economic value of urban forests in Canada. And we were trying to answer the question, how can we value urban forest ecosystem services, and then what tools are really important in supporting that valuation? This is a very large table. I don't know how interesting it is, but basically it's to show that we did this large review of urban forest ecosystem services, the metrics used to value them, and then some of the key findings around what those values are. We also looked at different tools that support these measurements, but that wasn't sort of my area in this report. And then we noticed that there are all these cultural ecosystem services in this review that we did, and that they're really not valued in monetary terms very often. So we decided then to sort of drill down into cultural ecosystem services and do a review of the academic literature to look at how we're valuing cultural ecosystem services, and then what kind of vegetation types we're usually looking at, and how we can link that better to our ongoing, or how we can create a better framework for ongoing evaluation of cultural ecosystem services. So we looked at how we value cultural ecosystem services. I need a better way to say cultural ecosystem services. It's like way too long. But anyways, cultural ecosystem services by vegetation type and by type of ecosystem service. And so we looked at mixed vegetation, trees, and green spaces because really those are sort of the main categories that are usually used to value these services. And that's largely because of the types of green information that we have available. And I'll talk a bit about that later. Then we sort of broke it down further and looked at the different types of metrics that are used to value these ecosystem services. And we discovered that not many of them are valued in monetary terms, I think because of the nature of cultural ecosystem services. But there have been many attempts to value these services using a wide variety of metrics. Some of the key outcomes of this research was that we found that green spaces and parks were the most often valued, which I find quite interesting because I don't consider them to be the type of green infrastructure with which we come into contact most often. Psychological health was the most studied, and this was sort of using a mixed vegetation approach, which you'll probably know as like the NDVI approach to measuring greenness exposure, most commonly done in public health. And then things like tourism, community development, and social health, so like social connection in green spaces, were the least studied. Multiple metrics were used, but only 11 included dollar valuations, and so this is a real, I think, potential area of research, putting dollar values on cultural ecosystem services so that those who aren't in the field of urban forestry or public health and greenness will understand what the value of these services are and know to invest in them. Okay, so moving on, because I have lots of things to cover. After doing this review and getting a better understanding of ecosystem services, it got me thinking about equity. Because really, ecosystem services are, they're clearly so important to our well-being that I became concerned that we were all having an equal opportunity to experience these services. And so I looked at the concept of urban green equity in North America and tried to understand sort of how the concept operates, how it operates on the ground, and what the state of things is, because it's still sort of an emerging area of research really in urban forestry. So just a working definition that we started off with and that I still think is fairly useful, although it's extremely broad, is that urban green equity is fair access to and governance of urban forests, regardless of differentiating factors such as socioeconomic status, race, cultural background, age, all of the things that you can think of that differentiate us. However, despite the fact that we have this working definition, it wasn't really clear what urban green equity means and how it's understood by various different academics and practitioners. Oh, I'm out of order. So, what I should have said is, we're interested in urban green equity, but I often like to answer the question, why does green equity matter? Does anyone here want to take a stab at why green equity matters? Why do you think it's important? Or if it's not important? You can make the argument. I'm totally open. Right, so you're saying that if you're living in a place without access to green spaces, then you're less likely to have some of these health benefits that others have. Yeah, exactly. So I don't think of green equity as a nice to have thing. I think of it as a really fundamentally important thing. And this is because if we accept that ecosystem services are important, we have to understand that ecosystem services are mediated by urban green equity. So it may be great that trees cause these or are associated with these really positive health outcomes. But for those who aren't living anywhere near green spaces, they're not experiencing those outcomes. And so urban green equity has a real impact on people's lives on a daily basis. And this is why I'm interested in this area of research. So the first thing that we did to try and understand what this concept was about was look at the dimensions of urban green equity. And the idea was to try and provide a framework for urban green equity analyses in the future, because so far most of the research has really taken place on a somewhat ad hoc basis across multiple different disciplines. So we did a review of the academic literature and some of the sort of policy and gray literature at the city level and came up with these dimensions of urban green equity and then subdimensions. So the key primary dimensions are spatial distribution and recognition, and I'll talk about each of those separately now. So spatial distribution has to do with how we are distributing urban green stuff in space. But it has these important subdimensions that influence how that spatial arrangement occurs and how people are able to access trees in that spatial arrangement. And the first really important one is temporality. And this has multiple other subdimensions that I just couldn't figure out how to put into a cool graphic. Someday I'll get training in infographic creation and then I will be happy. Anyways, so temporality has to do with a few things. One is that there's increasing evidence that the past history of development and power relationships in urban environments now influence current distributions of green things. And this makes sense because trees take a long time to grow, right? And so most of the research on this has been in the United States, but there's evidence, for example, that People of color tend to live in lower or areas with lower tree canopy because of redlining policies back in the early 20th century that prevented people from getting mortgages to buy houses in certain areas, and those were often greener areas. And so you see the continuation of patterns of inequity and inequitable distribution based on historical distributions of greenness and access to neighborhoods and housing finance. Another area relating to temporality is the idea of seasonality. So the type of tree you have in your neighborhood, whether it loses its leaves in the winter, whether you have a winter, these all affect how you're experiencing urban greenness over the course of a year. And then the other area of temporality, which I think is really important, is looking at people's time to access green spaces. And people don't often think about this, but depending on our life experiences, we have more or less time to recreate in the area around our home. So if we have, if we're very busy at work, if we are a single parent, for example, and don't have childcare support, if we work shift work, this provides us with fewer opportunities to recreate in greenness around our home. And so although it may be there, we may not be having some of these psychological benefits from that recreation. The next subdimension is condition. And this is, well, I think these are all really interesting areas of research, but condition and preference are ones that I would particularly like to be more involved in the future. So condition has a lot to do with, well, condition is the health and quality of the trees around you. And there's very little research so far on the quality of trees in urban space and how that influences the spatial distribution of ecosystem services derived from those trees. So trees that are less healthy are less likely to provide ecosystem services at the same level as healthy trees, and they are also potentially giving negative like disservices because being around trees in poor condition could have a negative psychological effect, for example. Then related to condition is preference. There are sort of a range of aesthetic preferences that are fairly consistent across cultures. However, there is definitely research showing that depending on where you grew up, you may have different preferences for different species of trees, different growth forms, and these may affect how you're experiencing place, for example, in urban forests. Across the board, condition is generally considered to be a negative thing if the trees are in poor condition, so these two dimensions really relate to each other well. And then ownership is a really important part of spatial distribution. So whether something is on public or private land, and if you live close to it, whether you can access it or not. So for example, if you live across the street from a golf course with really great trees, but you are not a member of that golf course, you can't go and recreate under those trees, but you can stand close to them. So depending on what kind of ecosystem service we're talking about, this may have an influence on how you're experiencing those services. Then the next dimension is recognition, and this is sort of a weirder one, I think, for some people in the natural sciences, but it comes out of a lot of the social justice research done in the 80s and 90s. Iris Young is one of the sort of pioneers of this field, talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion in decision making, basically. And so the word recognition has to do with whether or not you, your identity, and your views are recognized as important in a process, and so you're included, but also your difference is recognized and that it is valued. So important subdimensions of this recognition dimension are representation. So are you involved in a process? So for example, we're planning a park near your house. Are you part of the process to plan that park? Are you and your views represented in that process? And then the next dimension is procedure. So once you show up, you're represented, but is the procedure fair? And does it give you a chance to have voice and have influence on the process? Does it help you express your views? And then sort of related to those two are these more sort of life course subdimensions. So are you able to participate? Can you come to a decision-making process when it happens based on its timing, for example? Can you get there? Do you have a car to arrive at a workshop? Can you bring your kid? Or is there childcare? These are all things that can be barriers to participating in some kind of decision-making process. And then the last one, which I find really interesting, is do you have a desire to participate? So in public engagement, there's a lot of work and curiosity around how to get people to want to be involved because they have to give their time. And some of the ways that organizations really motivate or try to motivate people to be involved is by making the process relevant to them. Sometimes we don't think about the implications of how we design, for example, a public engagement process or a workshop, but our values are really a part of that process. And so we need to now work on sort of designing these processes in a way that motivates people who aren't like us to participate. And so some urban forestry groups in municipalities, for example, are linking up with faith groups or cultural days or family days to try and motivate people to participate in what the urban forestry department wants done through accessing some of the personal interests of different parts of the community. I don't know sort of what the right answer is to this. If I knew how to get everyone to desire to participate, I think I would be very famous. But it is interesting to see some of the attempts to get people more involved in processes by trying to make those processes reflect their interests. Okay, so I did this kind of more theoretical review of what urban green equity means, and then wanted to know, okay, well, how do practitioners in urban forestry understand urban green equity? How do they understand it, and how do they use it in their practice on a day-to-day basis? Because really, they have a strong influence on where trees go, how they're managed, why they're managed a certain way. So I went to Portland, Phoenix, and New York, and I interviewed people from sort of municipalities working in urban forestry and planning. I interviewed people from NGOs, some community members. It was really fun. I totally recommend doing something like this because you get to travel all these places and talk to people in your field. If I could just like tour around the world talking to people who are interested in the same things I was interested in, I think I would really like travel. I mean, I like travel anyways, but that would be my ideal way to travel because you get a really different sort of insight into the place where you're visiting. So we went to New York first because New York is sort of this really dense cosmopolitan city. It's expensive. They're already thinking about equity in terms of environmental justice and health. They have sort of, some of the health issues associated with dense cities. Also went to Phoenix as sort of an interesting case because Phoenix is very dry, very low density, very different from New York in that way. Has a large Latino population. It has a lot of issues with climate change, heat, water scarcity. It also has a lot of privatization, which is a little bit different from the other cases. And then Portland is the city that has been thinking about equity the most. So they have a bunch of equity policies that have been in place for the past few years. They're looking at increasing canopy in traditionally marginalized and underserved neighborhoods. They have a racial equity plan now, and they are also looking at diversity in hiring. So they were kind of our really interesting, motivated by equity case. The interviews focused around this kind of model of themes. So we wanted to know how practitioners defined urban green equity and then sort of what some of those sub-definitions are. What are the barriers that they have observed and experienced to green equity and some of the sub-barriers related to that, and then strategies they have used to overcome those barriers. These are the models that came out of that research, and they're really big and complicated. And I really actually could talk about these all day because I think they're super interesting, but I'm just going to talk about a few of the key things that we should think about. So for distributional equity, the three primary sub-definitions or definitions of distributional equity were fair access to trees, fair access to parks, and fair access to ecosystem services. And this really had to do with how practitioners were involved in urban forest management, some of their educational background, that kind of thing. And then interestingly, the primary barrier to green equity was articulated as the perception of urban forests as amenities. So as things that are nice to have, not important to have. And so some people explain this as, for example, well, when we build public housing, we give people running water, but we don't worry about giving them trees. And I think This also then is reflected in the idea that people sometimes don't like trees because of some of the disbenefits or annoyances or nuisances that they cause. So things like dropping leaves or dropping fruits. Then urban forests sort of seem like this thing, well, we don't really need to have them. You know, trees are great, but they drop leaves on my car, and so I'd rather chop down the tree in front of my house. And this affects how people will influence or experience ecosystem services. So then some of the sub-barriers related to this principal barrier are things like limited funding for urban forestry departments. I have never talked to anyone in any urban forestry department, and I've talked to a lot, who said that they have enough money. Everyone always wants more money. And so this has to do with budget allocations. And if we think that urban forests and trees are nice to have, not must have, then we're not going to allocate our budgets towards that area of work, right? Income inequality is a big one. Income inequality in different neighborhoods influences how much those neighborhoods can invest in their urban forest. Property ownership, of course, is a big one. How much the city can control what happens on private property versus public property. And I don't really have time to go into it now, but there's a lot of interesting kind of mixtures of property ownership arrangements in different cities. There's, of course, infrastructure conflicts, so trees and green spaces are damaged by conflict with gray infrastructure. In some cases, there's really a lack of information. We don't know what's happening in our urban forests. And people also reported experiencing a disconnection from nature. So if we've grown up in cities and we haven't grown up feeling sort of ownership and place in parks and in green spaces, we could feel a disconnection from nature in the urban environment and feel like they're not places for us to be. And so we don't spend time in them. Cities use various different strategies to overcome these barriers, like targeted tree and park investment, tree ordinances to try and control trees on private lands, park redesign to try and make things more open and encourage people to come into parks and recreate in them even if they've never done that before. They engage in research and urban forest resource assessment to understand what they have. I'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah, so that's what they're doing. In recognitional equity, this was sort of a less commonly discussed aspect of urban green equity, but some of the people who were really focused on kind of stewardship and had a more of a community focus had a lot of insight into recognitional equity, and I learned a lot from them. So they saw it as accessible and respectful decision making, accessible and respectful stewardship, so when the public is involved in stewarding trees and doing things like tree planting or pruning or invasive species removal, and then professional representation in the discipline of urban forestry, landscape architecture, all of these sort of green and allied professions. The principal barrier to recognitional equity, I think, is also an opportunity, but it was articulated as multiple identities and urban forest priorities. And so this is a good thing in a lot of ways, right? In multicultural cities, we all have different understandings of what's important in our neighborhood, and we have different priorities for our urban green spaces, but it means that it is really difficult to get all of those identities and priorities into how we're making decisions about trees. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done in how to do that well. Once again, sub-barriers included limited funding, income inequality, language barriers, so especially in cities with many different non-English languages, cities find it hard to provide, translation services and materials in those multiple languages. They are trying, though. Culture, so personal culture, I use the word culture taken widely, but culture is generally the intersection of different socio-demographic characteristics. So, for example, your income and your education and your age could be a part of your culture. Hiring practices were definitely identified as a barrier to recognitional equity. And then once again, this kind of sense of ownership. So this relates to the disconnection from nature and the distributional equity model. But if you don't have a sense of ownership over the green spaces in your neighborhood, then you're not going to want to spend time doing anything about them or engaging in managing them. There are a lot of different strategies used to overcome these barriers, a lot of partnerships with local communities, something called mosaic governance, which is allowing neighborhoods to really sort of govern their urban forests in their own way and not enforcing homogeneous governance across the landscape. So trying to allow people more freedom to do something that's really relevant to them. Trying to make public consultations more accessible by providing bus fare, by providing childcare, by having consultations at different times of day, having community advisory bodies where those who are interested can really dig into the practice of urban forests management and decision making. And then, as I've mentioned before, sort of these equity and diversity hiring policies to try and change the face of the green professions so that people can see themselves represented more frequently in those professions. So, as I mentioned already, some of the key results include that distributional equity was emphasized over recognitional equity. I think that this is certainly an issue to be explored more because these two dimensions really interact with each other, and so if we don't have a lot of recognitional equity, we're not necessarily going to have a lot of distributional equity. If the decision makers are not diverse, how is the distribution of urban forests going to serve diverse needs? Interestingly, there are similar themes among municipalities, so I expected to have to create different models for different cities, but there was a lot of commonality across the cities. However, equity really plays out through local issues that are distinct from one another. So Portland, for example, is dealing with a long history of white supremacy and excluding people of color from the state of Oregon. And so in general, the city is very aware of that history and trying to do more to empower people of color in a very white city. In Phoenix, the equity issues are primarily around climate change and extreme heat, access to water, access to shade along bus corridors, that kind of thing. In New York, they're really around these environmental justice zones and air quality. So although the themes are the same, the equity issues are different. In the interviews, the individual responsibility of the person I was interviewing really drove their theme focus in some ways, and so this is what I was talking about when I said that some people talked more about recognition and some people talked more about distribution, and that makes sense. And then very interestingly, fair has different meanings. So some practitioners said, okay, well, to deal with distributional inequities, I am targeting tree planting and maintenance in traditionally underserved neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods that are low income and have low tree canopy, we're going in more often and trying to engage the community and plant more trees. Whereas other practitioners said, look, we just offer the same thing to everyone, and that's fair. We don't offer more to the rich, we don't offer less to the poor kind of thing. We don't offer more in any neighborhood. We do the exact same thing across the board. And so they're not trying to right past wrongs or change existing inequities. They're just trying to offer the same thing everywhere. And this was often kind of framed in within the context of limited budgets. So we don't have a lot of budgets. We need to offer a basic level of service everywhere, so that's what we're going to do. However, I would argue that it also reflects a philosophical approach to the division of resources in society. And so in some cases, this sort of equal service delivery thing came up a lot more in Phoenix, a city that's much more privatized and has, I think, a lot more of a philosophical commitment to individual enterprise. And so I think that's also another area for more exploration. So after we looked at sort of these dimensions of green equity and what it means at the theoretical level and at the practitioner level, then we did an analysis of distributional green equity across the United States, trying to find out what the principal socioeconomic factors are that are associated with urban vegetation distribution, looking at multiple urban areas and different vegetation types, and then trying to understand whether different types of urban vegetation are differentially distributed. And this is really sort of in response to the fact that to date there have been very few pieces of research looking at distributional equity outside of one city or outside of beyond one type of greenness, and then that has created somewhat contradictory results across different geographic areas in terms of what factors are most associated with inequity. So we looked at 10 metro areas across the United States. I really wanted to include Canada in this analysis, but the remote sensing data in the United States is just a lot better. And so we chose these 10 urban metro areas just to represent sort of different geographical areas, different population densities, different building densities, to get sort of a broad range of urban environments that were included in the analysis. This is just sort of a brief schematic of our methods. We use the National Agricultural Inventory Programs. Yes, that's what it is, NEIP. The National Agricultural Inventory Programs 1 meter resolution imagery, which is available across the United States every 3 years, which is amazing, and for free. I wish we had that in Canada. So we identified greenness just using an unsupervised classification approach, really basic, and then aggregated greenness by block group, which is the smallest census unit that's publicly available, and it represents about 5, well, it depends on the population density, sort of 3 to 5 or 8 city blocks. There's about 5,000 people in each block group, if I remember correctly. And then we collected census data for all of these block groups and looked at associations using regression analysis. Just to give you an idea of what this kind of looked like, so we looked at the proportion of mixed vegetation in each block group. This is an example from Portland. We looked at the proportion of woody vegetation, so trees and shrubs, in each block group. And then we looked at the park area available within 1,000 meters of each block group. And this was intended to represent sort of the maximum walkable distance that you could get from your block group to a park. It's a long distance, and it's very different from what's often used in public health research, but we did this to avoid having a whole bunch of zeros and to allow for a broader comparison between block groups. We found that income and education are most strongly positively associated with urban forest access. Income made sense. I was surprised to see education coming out so strongly, and actually slightly more strongly than income. Park area is more equitable than mixed and woody vegetation cover. However, that doesn't mean it's equal, so it's definitely not equal. It's just not associated with these socioeconomic factors and sort of traditional power relationships in urban environments. Racialized populations have lower access to urban vegetation, both mixed and woody, in richer, larger, and denser cities. I would like to look into this further because I'm not entirely sure why this might be the case. I have some theories that, for example, when everyone is rich, then maybe we want to fight about race rather than income. It could be that there's more competition for urban space in these denser, richer places, and that's why then racialized populations have a harder time accessing greener areas. But it's totally unclear to me why this might be the case, and I think is an area for future research. The implications of this are that urban forests are a desired amenity. So the fact that urban forest access follows these traditional socioeconomic power divisions suggests that urban forests are something that we want. So I used the word amenity here. I should have used public good. But anyways, I think of urban forests as a public good, but we still think of them as amenities in society. It's also important to highlight that then canopy enhancement should focus on lower income or lower education neighborhoods. But based on my research on recognitional equity, I think it's important to note that urban forest intervention should also include recognitional equity. And so this means that we need inclusive decision-making and accessible stewardship, not just going in and planting trees wherever we want. What we want to make sure we avoid is causing harm through tree planting, for example, or through park management. That doesn't include the local community and reflect their views. Okay, so ongoing and future work. I think I'm doing okay for time here. This is the health stuff. I am now working with Matilda Vandenbosch, and I have Hind here as one of my collaborators also, and the Canadian Urban Environmental Health Research Consortium, CANU, and some collaborators at MIT to look at urban greenness exposure and public health on a broad scale. So the first kind of main project we're doing here is looking at urban greenness exposure metrics, trying to answer the questions: what remote sensing data sources should we be using to measure urban vegetation, and which ones should we be using for which health outcomes? And then something that's kind of come up in this research is how do time activity spaces affect greenness exposure? Because we're not all moving around cities in the same way all the time. Yeah, this is not really a complete list, but basically I'm looking at various different data sources to calculate NDVI, so different resolutions for different remote sensor or satellite imagery. Also the Green View Index derived from Google Street View, and then a high-res land cover vegetation map. And looking at greenness exposure using different buffer sizes around postal code points, because this is the commonly used spatial metric in public health research. Just for those who don't know about the Green View Index, it's derived from Google Street View using a method that was first developed by the Sensible City Lab in MIT, and if you want to learn more about it, you can read their paper on urban forestry and urban greening, or check out their Treepedia website, which is really cool. And they have this Green View Index information for cities all around the world. Basically, it takes Google Street View images and quantifies the amount of greenness in that image, and then removes things that are green signs, for example, not actual vegetation. Canoe has, they've implemented Treepedia scripts at 800,000 locations in Canada, so at each postal code location across the country. They've completed the sort of green pixels approach, which is the middle bar there, which is less accurate but very fast, and they're working on the image segments work, which is sort of a more complex machine learning approach to identifying greenness in images using this computer vision algorithms, but it takes longer. To be honest, I'm happy with the green pixels to some degree, but this image segments is a much better representation of the content in an image that is green vegetation. So hopefully we'll have access to this data set soon so that we can expand our research across Canada. Because right now we're sort of doing a pilot study in Vancouver. So looking at these different types of vegetation in buffers around different postal codes in Vancouver, and then looking at how they relate to each other and to different outcomes on the landscape and in sort of health research. This is just an initial comparison that I can show you looking at some of the different satellite data sources and the Green View Index. And what it tells us is that the perspective view Green View Index really does provide different information. So although the correlations are still relatively high, considering that these are measuring greenness in the exact same spot, there is a fairly large difference. And you can see that spatial scale is also important. So if we look at correlations at 1,000 meters with 100 meters, we can see that spatial scale is important. And this is part of why I'm really interested in these time activity spaces, because clearly how we spatially describe how people move through cities affects what kind of greenness they are exposed to. And we know very little so far about how people move through cities. So next steps, I'm just in the process of completing analyses of greenness measures and land surface temperature to try and figure out what types of data sets we should be using to measure the effect of greenness on land surface temperature, and then maybe heat-related mortality, and then also in the process of linking these data sets to health data sets in the RDC, which is a slow process, of course. And then I'm working on it for a month so far. Anyways, then sort of next steps, hopefully starting in January, would be to describe these time activity spaces, potentially in collaboration with UCLA or with the child study here in Canada. Another project that we're just starting is the Urban Environmental Exposures and Early Childhood Development work, Matilda's project called Born to be Wise, very cool name. And it looks at the impacts of environmental exposures on different dimensions of early childhood development. We just got the study protocol accepted for publication, and we'll be beginning work on that soon. And then my last area of current research is urban forest governance and resilience. This is also just getting off the ground, so I don't have any results to show you yet. But the idea is that as climate change and globalization and development progress, we need to plan and manage for resilient urban forests in the face of these pressures. And so trying to understand how we can govern urban forests in a way that increases resilience. So we are going to, we've already gone to Surrey and interviewed a bunch of urban forestry practitioners there. we'll be going to Prince George, Fort McMurray, and Oakville. And the idea is to understand, first of all, how urban forest governance takes place in these mid-sized cities, because they're not usually included in development or in research on urban forestry. I mean, you know, no one cares about Fort McMurray, but they experience real pressures. Fort McMurray experienced a wildfire really recently. Prince George has experienced the pine beetle outbreak. Surrey has a bunch of sea level rise pressures as well as rapid development. And so we're interested in exploring how these pressures are being dealt with at a managerial level. So future research. Really, my future research, I sort of see this all coming together as urban forestry for multicultural cities. I have a really deep personal interest in equity, and so this is what drives my research, and I believe will continue to drive my future research. Some of the areas that I would like to delve into in the future are looking at global urban green equity and health. So we now have interesting remote sensing data sets for around the world. So for example, the Sensible Cities Treepedia scripts have been implemented for multiple international cities, and they're a very collaborative group. So that gives us a lot of greenness information that is comparable across cities in different parts of the world. Some of Bean's work is looking at deriving socioeconomic status from remote sensing locations. So once again, getting these comparable data sets that we can use globally. And then there are, of course, these global health surveys that we can use to assess equitable access to urban green spaces, and then some of the public health implications of that. I'm also really interested in intersectionality and urban green equity, and this came out of my PhD research. So I was looking at some of the principal socioeconomic factors individually and their role on the distribution of urban greenness. But I think the research on sort of environmental justice, for example, is really moving into the area of intersectionality and understanding how these sort of more complex relationships between the different aspects of our identities and how that influences our power in urban space is really important when we talk about who has access and why. And these are also important when talking about recognition of green equity and decision-making processes. So I plan to use my existing data sets to expand this research using intersectional approaches in Canada and the US, and then see potential for this in various different places around the world. I have a particular interest in Latin America and Africa. Climate change is another sort of pressure that has the potential to increase or affect inequities in terms of access and in terms of health around the world. So looking at climate change impacts on urban forests, how this influences their ecosystem services, and then the potential exacerbation of existing green and health inequities. And then sort of my little longer term plans are to, well, not always longer term actually. This reflects, I'm actually kind of starting this now, I suppose. I was invited to participate in a book chapter on heterodox views of urban forests. So heterodox being the opposite of orthodox. Heterogeneous and diverse views of urban forests, what their values are, what ecosystem services mean, and really based in sort of grounded community linked research that tries to understand diverse urban forest values and perceptions. And then there's also some interesting machine learning approaches to this that I've been talking to Canoe about, using sort of crowdsourced computer vision approaches to measure different urban forest quality and values, and try and then apply those values over a larger landscape using remote sensing data. And then as a settler Canadian in urban forestry, I'm really interested in reconciliation with Indigenous Canadians and urban forestry, and the potential for intercultural exchange and learning via urban forestry. And I sort of consider this to be part of my personal responsibility in this field. I'm interested in learning more about Indigenous conceptions of urban forests and culturally relevant planning, design, and management. But this would have to be done on a partnership basis with interested Indigenous collaborators and partners, and is something that I plan to pursue going forward. I want to say thank you to my many supervisors, mentors, and collaborators listed here. Maybe I have forgotten some, I'm not sure. I will work on this list. But I have really enjoyed my time here at UBC, and particularly in the School of Population and Public Health, because it's been remarkably collaborative, and I have received support from many brilliant collaborators and mentors. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Lorien. So you've done fantastic in terms of timing. We do have a few minutes, and I will start with Karen.
That was wonderful. Really enjoyed the whole piece and how it all came together, and will be going forward as well. So my question is, in looking at some of the the directions that you're going to be going in, and this comes out of discussions that I've had with foresters around climate change. And so, for example, in this part of the world, the cedar, western red cedar, is in decline and probably is not going to survive. Definitely will not survive climate change. And the implication that has, not only on cultural but spiritual significance for our indigenous people. And so that got me thinking about, in the bigger picture, is that it's wonderful to think of the positive benefits that you're suggesting, but I'm wondering, how has thought been given, or have you talked to people about the mitigation of, everybody gets excited about putting trees in and then watch them die?
Thank you. That's an excellent question and observation. I actually have experience with this with some colleagues from the Squamish Nation that brought Western red cedar into the downtown east side as used sort of a spiritual and cultural process to bring this tree as a tree of cultural significance to an area that has a lot of marginalized indigenous people living there. And they had a ceremony, planted the tree, and it died. And it died after a couple of years. And so I think, yeah, we can think about the harm that making all that effort to plant the tree and then seeing it die could cause. I think that there's definitely scope for research on the potentially negative cultural impacts and spiritual impacts of climate change. And I am concerned that we're going to see most of our western red cedars die in the next 10 years. They're actively dying all around us, even in our natural areas. So if you walk through Pacific Spirit Park, they're dying. I think that from a management perspective, we could be doing more to save them. So we could be watering western red cedars all summer, even established western red cedars. And I've talked to some practitioners who are also concerned about hydrologic or some groundwater patterns, I guess, and how those are being changed by development. So it's not necessarily just a climate change impact. It's probably interacting with development and how we're changing our the movement of our groundwater. I know that some practitioners are, well, they're all aware of this and they're all concerned. I don't know if they're going to act fast enough. I think it will be a real tragedy if we allow our western red cedars to die out completely. And certainly, just sort of from a broader perspective, most urban forestry departments are moving from tree planting to tree retention as their targets. And I certainly encourage this because sort of politically, yes, tree planting looks great, but if you're only really maintaining 40% of the trees planted, it wasn't a good investment to begin with. And particularly if you're taking the time to go through a process that is culturally relevant to people and then that ends up in harm, I think that can be psychologically damaging.
Thank you, Lorien. We do have a question from one of our remote listeners. And the question goes like this. So is there any integration or conflict with the increasing interest in urban agricultural use of spaces with larger urban centers?
Thank you for the question. That's very interesting. I actually read online news article, or I think it was from The Atlantic. I read an article looking at the conflict between urban agriculture and gentrification and the price of land in San Francisco. And so I think that, I don't know if there's a right answer to this, but it's important to acknowledge sort of the various dimensions of benefit and pressure that urban agriculture brings. So urban agriculture, I think we can make a good argument, is a place, it provides food security in some places. Often urban farms provide real opportunities for social interaction and to get people involved in urban greenness where they might not have been before. They do a lot of good outreach just to children and students. UBC Farm, for example, also has a lot of intercultural learning programs that are interesting and programs for urban Indigenous youth. But at the same time, in a city like Vancouver that has real housing pressures and real land, the cost of land is increasing, there can be, I think, perceived negative impacts of urban agriculture when it takes away space for housing. And actually, this is another area that I'm really interested in, is the interaction between housing and urban green infrastructure generally in dense cities like Vancouver. And so I think that we should be looking a lot more at working with people who are experts in housing economics and sociology to understand how these can work together. So I don't think we necessarily have to assume that the more housing we have, the less green we have. I think we can be creative about that to some degree. But it's important to acknowledge that putting in more green space can lead to real inequities. People need places to live. So I acknowledge that.
Okay, sure, one more question.
Thanks, Lorien. It seems income plays a major role in how trees flourish in one community as opposed to the other. Now, if we cannot achieve equity in income, do we stand any chance at achieving equity in urban forestry? And if you can also comment, do you also see urban forestry as a policy burden? And if that is the case, do we then put more of the responsibility in the hands of the public sector? That will probably require policy to ensure equity in urban forestry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I often ask myself this because I see inequities perpetuating around the world in areas that are probably more important than urban forestry. I think that there's a couple of things to point out. First, equity doesn't mean equality, and so what I want to do with my research is try to start conversations around what green equity should look like. So we don't all want the same number of trees, we don't all want the same access, but what might it look like if we all had fair access and we all got what we wanted? So I don't think we're ever going to get to equality, but we can move towards equity, towards a world in which we have as much as we want, or we at least have the opportunity. I think that urban forests are really interesting from a policy perspective because they are these public-private resources. And so unlike income, although we do have tax redistribution, there's a direct role for government in providing greenness to, or a potential role if government wants to take that on, in providing greenness to underserved communities that cannot necessarily provide that investment themselves. However, I also think that, let me think about this actually. Yeah, so there is that role. I could see more government investment in urban forestry because right now it's not a priority. So I think we could be doing a lot better. Planting trees and maintaining trees is not an expensive proposition. We're seeing more and more awareness of that reality at the municipal scale and increasingly at the national scale as the concept of green infrastructure increases. And that's part of why we did this valuation research as well, to try and make the case that, look, we're getting all of these benefits, they have real economic value, and we're not having to invest a lot to get those values out. But I think this is also part of the reason that I'm interested in this kind of recognitional equity piece, because ultimately private citizens do need to control what happens in their area and their land. We can't be forcing people to have trees, but I think understanding the barriers to having trees around your house will help us find solutions. So for example, in Portland, a lot of lower income neighborhoods don't want to plant trees in front of their house because they're financially responsible for those trees, even if they're not on their property, just if they're across the sidewalk in the boulevard area. And so Portland now is trying to change that bylaw so that the city is responsible. And the city, through taxation, which is a redistributive policy tool, can then support lower income communities in having these trees by their houses without it being a financial burden. So there are clear, in some cases, policy barriers to equity that we can remove. And maybe we don't get to perfect equity, but we can move in that direction. And I think it's important for us to continue to try to do that.
And with this optimistic end, please join me in thanking Dr. Lorien Nesbitt for a fantastic talk. Thank you very much, Lorien.